This is the Benchmade 710 axis in CPM M4, powder metallurgy, high-speed steel, a high vanadium, high carbon, high-speed steel to be particular. Challenge this week is this. Your friend has picked up this knife, knows a little bit about steels, knows a little bit about geometry, enough to be sort of dangerous, and recognizes that the way this knife is ground isn't likely to bring out the true optimal performance of the steel. So the challenge is, in one YouTube comment box, describe how you would alter the geometry and what edge finish that you would put on it to maximize the performance of the steel, and cite the material's properties or the physics, whichever way you want to do it, that supports your argument. And again, you have one YouTube comment box to do that. Now, a little bit about this knife. I've wanted a 710 axis for quite some time. Goes way back to when they were first introduced. Never really got around to pulling the trigger and getting the one. I guess there's always knives that you're sort of interested in, and this never really came out at the same time it was in a steel sort of that I was interested in. And finally I got this for a number of reasons. Again, it was a 710 axis that I wanted to check out, and it was in CPM M4, and I have a Spyderco Air in the same steel, and the performance of this is really high in many respects, in terms of the ability to take and hold a relatively fine edge and sustain cutting on abrasive material. It does very well in both cases. So I wanted to see if Benchmade's was similar in that regard, and like I said, I wanted to see an axis lock, and in particular I wanted to see this knife because of comments and praise that it receives over the years. Plus it actually looks like a decent sort of knife. In retrospect, I've carried it for a few days. Performance is decent in some respects, not so decent in others. The edge angle and thickness are a little less than optimal for the steel. I don't want to get too much into that because it's related to the challenge. There are some issues with ergonomics. Mainly they have to do with sort of finishing of the handle more so than the general shape. The inside of the handle, the liners, this is relatively sharp. The slabs themselves have a slight flat milled on them, but the edges of the flat itself are left rather sharp, and the clip could use a bit more work. And in regards to a heavy hammer grip, where you're forward on the knife to try to reduce any kind of torque or leverage, this basically is pressed into the center of your hand. All of these issues could be resolved with a little bit of work, with a little bit of rounding, but the only thing is they would soften the edges of the knife, which may reduce it from a visual presentation point of view for some people. So I can sort of understand why they left everything relatively sharp. It does have a number of very strong positive attributes. I really like the way that the blade has a slight drop profile here, and that allows you to sharpen all the way back without developing any kind of funky area right here. It has a slight recurve, which gives some people fits in sharpening. The simplest solution is to use the actual edge or side of a bench stone if you want a bench stone sharpen, because that's generally narrow enough to work the entire edge relatively easily. Or use rods or something like Spyderco SharpMaker, obviously. In regards to performance, I did some shallow wood cutting, and it's about 50% that of a standard Mora, and that's because the angle is quite high. Using a heavy force, it actually picks up and pulls ahead, of course because of the primary grind, which thins it out and which equalizes the performance, so it can cut roughly the same 1-to-1 with a Mora. These little things I talked about with the handle are enough to sort of make it not comfortable, but I wouldn't say it's uncomfortable. I can easily do around 500 relatively heavy cuts into, say, hardwood flooring, and you're just sort of noting that the handle is not really comfortable. It's not really hot spotting or aggravating. It's not like, say, the 0561 ZT, that after you do a couple of cuts you really start wondering if it's a handle at all. The only thing that is relatively disappointing was the really mangled edge that they put on it. Essentially, they formed the edge with a very low grit belt, and then they just leaned into it with a buffer and just went to town. So you ended up initially with this sort of wavy edge that the high points were essentially the teeth, and sort of scalloped out between them was just where the buffer sort of had worn it away. So the edge came basically really highly stressed, and parts of it had even shown significant deformation. So it wasn't what you would call sharp by any means. I mean, yeah, it could slice newsprint, had no ability to push cut, and could scrape a little bit if you sort of pushed it into your arm. But even after that light amount of woodworking, you know, around 500 slices or so, boom, the edge was gone and completely smooth, and you could sort of rake your fingers back over it harmlessly. And that's one of the points about knives and steels like this that I find kind of amusing. I mean, they go to all the trouble to put a very expensive steel. I mean, M4 itself is not an inexpensive steel, and the powder metallurgy steels in general are very expensive. And then they spend, you know, literally pennies on the sharpening, so you end up with a knife that matches the performance of about 420 J2 stainless at best, because of the very poor initial edge that's put on it, and is able to match at best the performance of a standard more in heavy cutting, and then a light cutting falls behind it. And comparing it to something like the Spyderco paramilitary, radically outperformed. I checked the numbers that I had for the Asbox paramilitary when I got it, and it was 2 to 1 on this in terms of ability, and I was measuring cutting hemp rope at the time. And Spyderco paramilitary could actually push cut the hemp rope with the same force that this actually used in a 2-inch slice, which showed how dramatically different they were. And again, it's because of the edge thickness and the edge angle that they use. And Benchmade has always had that sort of reputation as being more of a tactical type knife, and Spyderco was more of the knives designed to cut well and be more for utility. But there's a lot of potential in this knife, a lot of potential, and I can see with some work at challenging the role that the paramilitary has as one of my main carry blades. I'm not really going to talk about in detail about what I'm going to do with the blade, because again, that's part of the challenge, but I will make all those changes to the handle, round it out a little bit, take all the sharp edges off, and do a little bit of work on the clip. But in general, the handle is very well. It's not shape indexing strongly enough to be restrictive, so basically even from saber to hammer to any kind of reverse or ice pick grip, it's relatively comfortable in all of them. And the clip, like I said, is not what I would call bad, it's just not what I would call good. Some of the newer Spyderco clips are done very well. Everything is nice and fully round, almost at the stage where they're similar to the wire clips. The only real concern I have is the springs for the access lock. If they give out, of course, the lock itself is not functional. It was more of like a slip joint at that point. But I've had a Ritter with an access lock for quite some time. My brother's carried it for years and everything is still functional, so we'll see what I get with the luck of the draw on that. One thing that I want to mention though is that this lock in general, the access lock, is an example of a properly designed lock. And what I mean by that is forces that are exerted on the blade to try to force it closed, which are forces down sort of this way, or forces which try to rotate it back that way and actually break the lock itself and snare it off, can't act to actually release the lock. To see to release the lock, you have to push it back, pull it back this way. Lateral forces on the blade are not going to do that, because the blade is actually underneath this pin, so moving the blade back and forth this way doesn't exert a significant force to move that back. Bringing the blade up or down doesn't. You would actually have to take this pin and drive it up through the handle scales and the liners and break the lock. That's very different than liners and integrals, because forces on the blade can actually make the liner or integral disengage. That can't happen here, and it's just a way because the lock is constructed that the pin sits on top of the blade, not directly underneath it. So it's a very well executed lock from that respect. And like I said, the only issue is the omega springs, which are not frequently talked about, but they do fail on occasion. Other than that though, very nice knife, and I really look forward to using it much more extensively. I'm going to carry it with the stock profile for a while, just to get a feel for the performance in a bit more detail, but I will end up modifying the blade later on to maximize the performance of the steel, and hopefully it will be as good or maybe even better than the Spyderco Air, which is proving to be a wonderful small utility knife, very easy to sharpen, can retain a high sharpness and a high polish, and can also has the ability to retain extended slicing aggression as well, and that's sort of what you expect from high-speed steels in general. That's mainly what they're designed to do.